Along a muddy riverbank beside the swollen waters of the Moselle near Nancy, France, a creaking wooden trestle bridge shudders under the relentless pull of the current. It is September 1944, and the Third Army is pushing hard against the eastern bank. Standing knee-deep in gray clay is Corporal Eli Vance, 23, holding a mud-splattered grease pencil with a folding wooden carpenter's ruler protruding from his thigh pocket. Behind him, the idling engine of a 30-ton Sherman tank rattles the loose planks of the bridge abutment. General George S. Patton, Jr. stands beside his open command jeep, waving his arm forward, shouting for the heavy armor to cross without delay. But as the lead tank grinds its steel treads toward the wooden deck, Vance moves. He steps directly into the path of the track, raises both palms, and shouts above the roar of the motor. If that 30-ton rig touches the second span, the whole timber bed shears, the entire riverbank freezes, drivers cut their throttles, staff officers stop mid-stride, and Lieutenant Colonel Frank Mercer of the 1303rd Engineer Regiment closes his eyes. Bracing for the inevitable explosion from the three-star general, Patton stops, lowers his hand, and stares at the young corporal. He does not yell, nor does he reach for his sidearm. What happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether an entire armored advance made it across or sank into the mud. And the answer was not what anyone on that riverbank was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Every single week, we bring you the quiet moments and forgotten decisions that truly changed the course of history. Let me back up a second. Because to understand what it cost Corporal Eli Vance to step directly in front of a moving steel tread, you have to understand what the Moselle River looked like in September 1944. It was not a clean military maneuver from a textbook. It was a churning cauldron of gray mud, freezing water, and relentless diesel exhaust. The Third Army was pushing hard across eastern France, grinding through heavy rain that turned every dirt road into liquid clay. Near Nancy, the river was swollen and angry, tugging violently at the shaky wooden timbers of a hastily patched trestle bridge. Hundreds of men, supply trucks, and armored vehicles were jammed along the narrow western approach, shivering in drenched uniforms while German artillery shells occasionally rumbled in the distance. The air smelled of wet wool, scorched clutches, and raw tension. In a forward engineering zone like that, noise was constant, patience was non-existent, and every second was measured in gallons of wasted fuel and lost tactical momentum. In that kind of environment, military hierarchy was absolute. A three-star general like George S. Patton, Jr. was not a commander you argued with, nor was he a man you delayed. He was a force of nature who demanded relentless, aggressive speed above all else. For a low-ranking combat engineer, a 23-year-old corporal, to physically place his body between a general's direct order and a 30-ton tank was technically an act of unthinkable insubordination. There were seasoned captains, majors, and staff officers standing along that riverbank who could clearly see the sagging timbers of the middle span. They knew the structure looked dangerously fragile, yet every single one of those officers performed the exact same silent calculation. They weighed the terrifying risk of a collapsing bridge against the immediate certainty of Patton's legendary fury, and they chose to keep their mouths shut. The operational stakes were completely unforgiving. Every hour the armor remained trapped on the western bank was another hour the enemy had to zero in their mortars and fortify the ridge on the eastern shore. If the crossing stalled, the entire advance collapsed into a deadly bottleneck. But the arithmetic of heavy armor is unyielding. A 30-ton Sherman tank carries a precise physical burden. If the structural load exceeds the shear strength of saturated white pine, the math does not offer second chances or political compromises. Dropping a lead tank into 30 feet of swollen, fast-moving water would not just drown the crew, it would destroy the bridge entirely, blocking the river for days, wasting thousands of gallons of precious fuel, and trapping an entire battalion without armor support. That was the brutal operational equation staring down the Third Army, and that was the riverbank. Corporal Vance stepped out onto. Picture the scene along that freezing riverbank. Over 50 men stood completely frozen in the falling drizzle, their heavy wool coats weighed down by gray clay. The air was thick with the acrid stench of idling diesel exhaust and raw timber, mixed with the cold smell of the swollen Moselle. The only sound was the low, rattling vibration of the 30-ton Sherman tank and the ominous creaking of saturated pine trestles fighting the angry current. Every eye on that muddy bank shifted rapidly between Corporal Eli Vance, standing straight in front of the steel tracks, and General George Patton, whose wet 3 stars gleamed under the dreary sky. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Merce and his staff officers stood stiffly beside the command jeep. Holding their breath, Mercer knew the load calculations. He had seen the middle span flexing under the river's pull, yet he had chosen cautious silence over confronting the general's relentless drive. Everyone present knew Patton's reputation for ruthless speed, and nobody wanted to be the officer who halted the Third Army. The surrounding engineers and tank crewmen watched in total stillness, privately measuring the drop into 30 feet of fast water, and bracing for the explosive confrontation they were certain was coming. They expected a sudden outburst of fury, an immediate demotion, or a harsh command to drive forward regardless. Stay with me, because what happened next on that muddy riverbank is the part nobody present was remotely expecting. The accounts that survive from the combat engineers gathered along that muddy riverbank are remarkably consistent in shape. They described a sudden, heavy silence falling across the Moselle River, broken only by the cold water slapping violently against damaged pine trestles, while dozens of officers and tank crewmen waited for the general's inevitable explosion, not the explosive rage the officers along the embankment were bracing for. Not the furious threat of an immediate court-martial or a reckless command to drive the armor forward, regardless of the structural danger. He looked at Corporal Vance the way a master builder looks at a load-bearing calculation. General Patton turned away from the lead tank's iron tracks, stepped up onto the steel bumper of his open command jeep, and climbed onto the flat hood. He sat down, pulled his heavy wool coat tight against the cold French drizzle, folded his arms across his chest, and stared quietly out over the riverbed. He did not issue a single reprimand. He did not utter a single word. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Mercer later described the next 2 hours as the most surreal experience of his entire military service. Patton sat completely motionless atop that jeep hood, watching every single movement on the riverbank with sharp, silent attention. Down in the gray clay and freezing current, Corporal Vance did not pause to celebrate his survival or catch his breath. He immediately reached into his thigh pocket, pulled out his folding wooden carpenter's ruler, and began barking precise engineering directions to his squad. They hauled massive oak beams into the churning water, driving heavy support piles directly beneath the sagging second span, while 3 bright stars watched from above. See, what most folks don't realize is that Patton's legendary drive for violent speed was never built on blind recklessness. He was an aggressive commander, but at his core, he was a deeply practical thinker who respected unvarnished reality above military titles. He understood that a subordinate officer who stays silent or nods along out of fear is an operational hazard, while a frontline sapper who physically steps in front of a 30-ton tank, because he knows the exact shear strength of wet pine is the highest kind of asset. The arithmetic of war is completely uncompromising. Dropping a 30-ton Sherman into 30 feet of freezing river water would not have bought speed. It would have shattered the trestle completely, choked a vital military artery for 3 entire days, and trapped an entire infantry battalion on the wrong shore without armor support. Patton did not see insolence on that muddy bank. He saw an absolute physical truth, presented by a man who knew his trade inside and out. In those 2 quiet hours on the hood of his jeep, a famous 3-star general willingly deferred to the unyielding laws of physics, choosing to trust the structural judgment of a 23-year-old corporal over his own fierce desire to drive across the river. Every officer who served under General George S. Patton Jr. during the European campaign understood that the Third Army operated at a tempo unmatched by any other command. Decisions that would take days in rear echelon headquarters were executed in minutes along the forward line, driven by Patton's belief that speed, audacity, and relentless pressure were the ultimate life-saving tools on a battlefield. Yet this relentless drive was balanced by an unyielding respect for practical competence on the ground, proving time and again that a commander who listens to physical ground truth is a commander who achieves decisive victory. The historical records preserved from the Third Army's advance across Europe demonstrate a consistent pattern. Tactical momentum relied not merely on grand strategic maps, but on the quiet, unheralded competence of ordinary soldiers doing their duty under extreme pressure, whether in the freezing mud of the Ardennes or the dust of western France. Moments of unexpected courage and technical precision defined the true character of the Allied war effort. Eli Vance was 23 years old, born and raised along the low riverbanks of Louisville, Kentucky. His father had spent 30 years working as a master carpenter along the Ohio River, constructing heavy timber caissons, barge docks, and flood retaining walls. Eli learned the wood trade before he ever held a rifle. By the time he was 16, he could estimate the grain density of saturated pine, with his eyes closed, and calculate load-bearing shear limits in his head. Before his draft notice arrived in the spring of 1942, Eli worked for a local construction company, spending 12-hour shifts knee-deep in gray mud reinforcing river abutments. He had a younger sister named Clara who sent him letters every 2 weeks, and a girl back home named Martha who worked as a clerk at the quartermaster depot in Jeffersonville. They kept a small ledger in her dresser drawer, tracking saved wages to buy a small lumber supply shop when the war finally ended. Eli did not consider himself a warrior or a battlefield hero. He was simply a skilled craftsman wearing an army uniform. He was not a dramatic man. He was the kind of man who looked at a timber bed and saw the invisible laws of physics holding it together. He was the kind of man who understood that structural strength does not yield to rank or ambition. When the final support beam was notched into place 2 hours later, and the lead Sherman crawled across the reinforced second span without a single creak, Vance did not celebrate. He did not look up toward the jeep to see if the general was watching. He wiped the thick river clay from his hands onto his field trousers, unfolded his grease-stained carpenter's ruler, checked the span alignment one last time, and folded the wooden segments neatly back into his thigh pocket. Then he turned to his squad leader and asked where the supply truck had dumped the next crate of steel timber spikes. For Vance, stepping in front of that moving tank had not been a grand gesture of defiance. It had been a routine professional obligation. A wooden bridge either held or it sheared, and he was not going to let 30 tons of iron destroy a structure on his watch. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Mercer of the 1303rd Engineer Regiment survived the long march across Western Europe and returned home to Ohio, where he spent nearly 3 decades teaching civil engineering at the State University. In a recorded oral history taken shortly before his death in 1978, Mercer was asked about that cold afternoon beside the swollen Moselle River. He did not dwell on General Patton's legendary temper or the pressing demands of the Third Army's advance. Instead, Mercer remembered the quiet rhythm of Corporal Vance's hammer echoing across the gray water, and the profound restraint of a famous general who knew when to sit still and let a true craftsman do his job. Was General Patton right to halt an entire armored division on the muddy bank of the Moselle and wait 2 full hours on the authority of a junior corporal? Some would say that allowing a 23-year-old sapper to publicly countermand a general's direct order dangerously undermines military discipline. They argue that in the relentless drive across Western Europe, where momentum was everything, allowing lower ranks to question operational mandates sets a precedent that could paralyze an entire advancing army. Others would say exactly the opposite. They argue that true leadership requires the discipline to recognize unyielding physical realities over rank, and that listening to an ordinary soldier who truly knows his craft is the highest mark of practical command. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.